Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Thanks for tuning in. Let's do some destination check. If you're looking for the most awesome session of the day at this private networks forum event, then you're at the right place. We indeed have an very interesting subject at hand. It's about spectrum. What can be more important than spectrum for wireless networks, right? And we have a perfect set of expert panelists to discuss this with, who represent different parts of the private networks ecosystem. Let me start with some quick introductions. I am Prakash Sangam, founder of Principal at Tantra Analyst. We are a boutique research, analysis, and advisory firm covering 5G, AI, and other tech areas. Personally, I have more than 20 years of experience in the cellular industry, working for Ericsson, AT&T, and Qualcomm, in that order. I write for Forbes, Fears, RCR, and a few other publications, and I'm a 3GPP member. I also host a podcast called Tantra's Mantra, where I discuss and interview many telecom executives. Enough about me. Let's now introduce our esteemed panelists. I would like to request each of them to give a brief introduction about themselves, their company, and also briefly mention the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity in terms of spectrum for private networks from their company or domain standpoint. Again, the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge that they see for spectrum for private networks from their company or domain standpoint. So let's start with Christian, followed by Makis, Richard, and Sam. Christian.
Yes. Hello everyone. My name is Christian Régnier. I am a co-founder of Agur Association in France in 2012, and I'm also a co-founder of EURENA Association, European Users of Wireless Enterprise Network Association, in November 2021. I worked a lot of time in Air France KLM, and I was the first to start a POC in private LTE network for the airport of CDG in 2017. It's my story.
All right. Makis?
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Makis Kokos. I am with Nokia. I'm head of technology ecosystems in Nokia Enterprise Solutions, where we do private networks. We have options for what we call digital automation cloud from Nokia, which is a plug and play with applications system, and also a modular private wireless, which is more like providing the elements for autonomous systems or with partners. So I have been the last 5 years working in this area. Additionally, I am the technical chair of the Multi-Fire Alliance MFA, where we have been doing some work since 2015 to look at private networks. We started with unlicensed spectrum, and now we moved also to locally licensed spectrum. And we have been producing the blueprints, which we hope that they will be very helpful for the verticals and industry in order to understand what actually to bridge the gap between the technology that we do in 3GPP and the needs that they have for actually making money in their own business. So the opportunity here is that we have seen in the last years is for spectrum is to use the locally licensed spectrum. And this is something that we've seen growing in countries and in regions, which is very important. And I think gives a lot of freedom and a lot of options to enterprises to deploy a private network and really go out of the traditional type of networks as we know them, the consumer type. Now, the challenges we have seen, especially from the early times when we looked at the multi-fire, and now looking at the 5G cases with localized licensed spectrum, is the ecosystem growth, especially on devices. If you look at what exists in the market right now, everything is focused to the consumer type. So we want really to grow this so that it matches also the need for the industry.
Thank you. Christian, you did mention the challenge and the opportunity. Quickly, you could say that.
Yes, thank you for that. It's Arena, again, the association that we created. It's really to work on the spectrum environment in Europe and how can I say, to try to have an harmonization between the different countries in Europe, because you know, maybe in Germany there is some spectrum for 5G deployment on private network. It's the other spectrum in France. It's the band 38 for 4G, on 5G it's another spectrum. It's not the same in UK. In some countries you don't have any spectrum for private network. It's really what I want to do with the Arena, and it's really the challenge in the next year, is to be sure that all of the enterprises in the European area will be able to deploy private network for the Industry 4.0.
And thank you. Richard?
Yeah, I think you said it right, Prakash. This is by far going to be the most important group of the day, and why? Has spectrum anywhere in the world been more at the top of mindset of people than it is today? I don't think so. I think that the options, the choices, the direction of R&D, the potential for some harmonization and other things is huge. My name is Richard Bernhardt. I'm the National Spectrum Advisor for the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, commonly known as WISPA. We represent about 1,000 fixed wireless and hybrid network ISPs across the United States and into several other countries. I'm also on the board of directors for the Wireless Innovation Forum. WIN Forum is a global standards development organization, and in the United States was responsible for setting up the baseline standards for CBRS, which is a band in the United States which allows for flexible and shared use, and certainly private networks. And I'm also the co-chair of the 6 gigahertz MSG, or multi-stakeholder group, in the United States, formulating the next use of the 6 gigahertz band. As you can see from the people in this panel, most of the people in this industry wear a lot of hats, and the reason they wear a lot of hats and they wear a lot of different technological hats is that there's a lot of choices. For us, the predominant focus is on CBRS right now for private networks, especially in 5G, as the band 48 options, both for fixed wireless options and for mobile, are there. Private networks are a new, exciting, shiny opportunity, and we see a lot of things coming in the United States. We don't yet have localized private spectrum, but we do have bands that entertain 5G private networks, and I look forward to chatting with you all about it.
Thank you, Richard. Sam?
Thanks, Prakash. Hi, my name is Sam Darwish. I work for Viavi Solutions. For those of you that don't know Viavi is a test and measurement company that's been around for nearly 100 years now in various guises. So you might recognize it as Actana or WaveTech and Golterman, or even JDSU. So we rebranded about 5-6 years ago to Viavi now, and still people are learning the name. So, but we've been in this industry for a long time, enabling our customers to roll out next generation networks. My responsibility within the organization is the 5G field test portfolio that we offer across EMEA. So really working with the service providers and the associated ecosystem to ensure that they can roll out the networks efficiently and meet the expectations that we have as consumers as well. With regards to the challenges, actually Christian touched on it. In EMEA, there's no real direction in terms of everyone has their own allocations. Everyone has different technologies in those allocations as well. So harmonizing across them is probably quite challenging, I'd suggest, but definitely an opportunity there. From a test and measurement perspective, the opportunity is we've got solutions that allow you to see what's going on in the network. So we have visitors come over from various parts of the world when they're doing sporting events, things like that, and they want to deploy their own solutions, but they have to travel to each individual country to see where they can deploy their own little private network. So there's opportunity there. We work very closely with a lot of these companies to help them allocate that and develop those. But it's a very exciting time, lots going on, lots of changes. Lots of new solutions available as well. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
And thank you, guys. Great to have all of you here. Just a quick note, we will take questions from the audience, so please do keep them coming. You can type them in the chat section of the portal. All right, so coming to the subject, as we all know, private networks topic has seen strong traction recently. If you ask me, actually, many stars are aligning for private networks right now and the industry itself. No, it is very well poised for an explosive growth. For example, the strong launch of a first phase of 5G, primarily targeted smartphones and broadband, is ready to embark on the second phase, which is squarely focused on the industry verticals. That's where private networks play a key role. CBRS, after initial hiccups, is ready to take off. Many of industry verticals now readily realize the potential of 5G in their respective fields and so on. One of the main discussion points and the focus areas really for private networks has been in spectrum, because as we all know, wireless networks run on spectrum and they're blood and flush of the networks. Different regions have adopted different approaches to this to spectrum specifically. Some offer dedicated spectrum, some leverage shared spectrum, and so on. With the backdrop of all of that, let's first start with some basic questions. So specifically, when we are talking about private networks here, it's about private enterprise networks, deployed by industries, and educational institutions, enterprises, and so on, right? So in the short term, I believe the spectrum will depend on type of technology these networks will use, right? So let me ask this question to our panelists. Do you think private networks will use Wi-Fi, cellular, or both in the near future? Let's start with Christian.
Good question and interesting question, because we receive this kind of question from the industry, a lot of end users. If I present some project regarding the private, it's always the same question. I have a Wi-Fi, why I will need a private network? For me, we need the both. It's not for the same use cases. It's clearly the use cases behind that. For the Wi-Fi, it's really adapted in the offices with laptops, something like that. At home, it's sure, but for the mobile aspect, for example, in the airport, I know really well the airport. For example, on the Wi-Fi is not the best regarding the handover, something like that. And we can see that the 4G and 5G network are really aligned also with the historical PMR solutions, the Tetra network, for example, for the voice, and the continuity of the voice with the PMR on the critical network. For me, it's really the 4G private network and 5G private network, because we can have the same SLA with the same good coverage, something like that. On the Wi-Fi, it's not to abort the Wi-Fi. Some use cases in factories, for example, it could be interesting to keep the Wi-Fi, or for the offices. For me, it's the both, and it's really to be careful with the use cases behind that.
All right, Marcus?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Christian. I think Wi-Fi is good for home, for shopping malls, maybe for some office applications. But if you look at the industrial grade kind of applications we're looking, I think they are more, they need more coverage, more reliability, more uplink capacity, device connectivity, latency, better latency. So the question is always, can Wi-Fi satisfy these needs? And the answer looks like that it's kind of difficult. So that's where 5G is going to play the role here to bridge this gap, because the idea is not to have the 5G in the industry, just to have another system to connect. It is really to save money to these businesses. I mean, every time they can make a better synchronization of the cranes in a port or in a logistics company, I mean, this is translated into millions of dollars or euros. So the idea here is that when you have a system that can really offer you these solutions, like this 5G, then absolutely you need to go for it. The other thing with Wi-Fi is we have seen, we compared a little bit, we've done also in MFA some studies, compared it with 5G, 3GPP technologies, and it looks like they're lacking behind. I don't say we should exclude them or take them out of the offices. No, we have means to share with Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi can be good for non-critical applications. It has an ecosystem which is very critical, so we can use it, but I think they can coexist together. But when we look towards the more demanding applications and the ones that we are going to really make the industry change, that will be 5G, not Wi-Fi.
Good, thank you. Christian?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Richard, sorry.
You look alike. No, I've been asked this question maybe 1,000 times, especially against CBRS. When we're looking at CBRS, I also serve as the chair of the fixed wireless group for OnGo Alliance. And it's always, should it be 5G CBRS or should it be Wi-Fi? And the answer is yes. There is no one or the other necessity. They're compatible in many respects. One serves one purpose, the other serves other purpose, and then there's some overlap to them. But when you start to underestimate the value and use of Wi-Fi, you run into problems. Wi-Fi, traditional Wi-Fi, has a considerable amount of limitations, but just like the extension of 3GPP applications and technologies, Wi-Fi is extending itself as well. If you look at the newer Wi-Fi 6 applications and 6 gigahertz applications, the latencies are comparable with 3GPP. The ability to do timing is there. OFGMA applications are there, which is not to say that Wi-Fi should be replacing 3GPP. I think you use the tool that makes the most sense in the right application. In critical applications, as Makis was saying, in critical applications, I think you're going to see more of an emphasis on carrier grade 5G, 3GPP applications for perhaps things like running nuclear plants or precision industrial applications. But I still think you have a very strong case for bringing in 3GPP and using either Wi-Fi or some form of Wi-Fi 6 or other Wi-Fi technology in the mix. So my take is private networks will involve both.
Very well. Sam?
Yeah, I'd agree with all the panelists there. So I do believe that they'll coexist, but it will depend on application. So one of the big things that's been, perhaps I might have missed it if someone's mentioned it, is the number of devices that can connect as well. So in certain applications where connectivity is critical, such as hospitals, for instance, for patient care, that might be something that you want to rely on 5G for. Maybe as Richard mentioned, Wi-Fi is catching up. But then there's going to be other applications where connectivity might not be the key thing, but having a large number of devices connected. So you could look at the agricultural space where they might have sensors in different parts of a farm or things like that. So it really does depend on application and need. But I think as well that both will coexist.
Cool. So yeah, I agree. That's looks like the common denominator. Both will coexist. That's great. So Sam, let's start with you now. If you have to use all kind of spectrum, right? So we are talking about industrial verticals here who are not telecom experts as such in developing, deploying, and managing these networks. So adding all of these different spectrum types, wouldn't that complicate the deployment for them? Just not deployment, even management on a long-term basis. They've been using Wi-Fi for a long time. Cellular is different. So if you're using all of these together, wouldn't that complicate things? What we have seen. Let's start with Sam, as I said.
I think it can do potentially in Europe, right? Where we've got so many different the way it's been implemented is very different. So the potential there is for a service-led solution where someone else is managing that solution for you. So you've seen new vendors come offering solutions in a box. You've seen companies that have been doing it for a number of years already. But it will be complex, no doubt, because you've got unlicensed spectrum you've got technology deployed at different parts of the spectrum in different countries. So even if you've got cross geography campuses, how will that all work? That all needs to be managed. So I see the opportunity for vendors to offer this as a service rather than as you buy a solution off the shelf and install it. That could be fine for some smaller companies, but for those that are more relying on it for production or for monitoring or these critical applications, I'd see it as a service rather than a buy off the shelf kind of solution.
Richard?
I'd agree. I think it's the opening of a whole new industry, to be honest with you, because it allows for some great customizations that we weren't seeing before, localizations. You can make networks that work in specific regions. You can have them for specific applications and uses. And I think that the managed service portion of this is ripe for that. There are people that the only thing they know how to do is plug and play, and that's fine. And even in industry, I find that to be the case. So there is a service industry begging to be out there to help the back end, help customize individualized vertical market uses, IoT, SCADA, agriculture, government uses, venues. There's vertical markets all over the place that are just waiting to have some of this come in. And I think service-oriented managed services and assistance is very important.
Marquis?
Yeah, I agree both with Richard and Sam. I think the issue is that regulation is different in different countries when it comes to the idea of locally licensed spectrum, and every country has a different rhythm of accepting these ideas. And we need to understand that all the enterprises, they are not the same in what they request. There could be like web scales and bigger companies that they want more like a carrier grade kind of solution where the operations can be done by a CSP or something. But there will be like the medium or small enterprises that they would like to own their network, and especially if you think that data or own data they want to really keep in premises, for example. Sometimes there are a lot of different options here. So we need to understand that this spectrum, different types that we need to have. So locally licensed spectrum is very important, and although it can give a different options for deployment, we really need to look forward into this and maybe try to harmonize the spectrum, or maybe even try to get a little bit more the industry to create the ecosystem, because it is also the features that are not there yet to provide. So yeah, I agree with Sean and Richard in this.
Christian?
No, it's clear. Today it's a nightmare for the enterprises, because they hear the spectrum, private spectrum in some countries, nothing in the others. It's CBRS on Go, it's another aspect. The process are not the same in the different countries. A lot of enterprises, they don't know what is the regulator. In France, ARCEP, a lot of enterprises, they don't know ARCEP, because they didn't have any contact with ARCEP before. Just the telecom specialist in some big companies, they had the contact with ARCEP for the PMR to obtain private spectrum for the PMR, the Tetra and the DMR. But today, with the 4G and 5G, it's linked with the data connectivity, but also with the 5G, it's linked with the business of the enterprises. It's not the IT, it's the business. And it's also a nightmare for them. I think really that today the market is not starting because of that, of the organization of the industry, of the different industrials in front of the how can I say, the ecosystem of the private network with core, with RAN, with the spectrum, private or not, the public operator, integrator. I think really that it's a new subject for some integrators to take all of the skills, be just, how can I say, between the device, but also with the IT and the application. And today, it's really the difficulty that I see. On Arena again, we created that to to facilitate for the industrial to understand better if they need or not this kind of new connectivity for their to be more efficient, I think, really.
Right, thank you. So let's start with Richard now. So, I mean, as I mentioned, uh, some parts of some regions like Europe has dedicated
Yes.
spectrum for private networks, and like in US, it's kind of shared spectrum approach.
Hmm?
I think these things will evolve in the future across the globe. What do you think is the best option? Is dedicated spectrum a good way to go about it to stimulate the industry, or shared spectrum, or mix of both? And what are some of the advantages, disadvantages there, Richard?
Well, I admire the various models around the world because we are very stuck in our ways in the United States. So it would be a nice change to either see a greater harmonization between nations so that you had a little more flexibility to use the same equipment across bands in different countries. But even if that were the case, you'd have to also synchronize the standards and the rules, which is likely not to happen. So do I think that the idea of a localized licensed network or even unlicensed is better? I think it's a great option. In the United States, we are just beginning to look at those kind of options. We have a lot of spectrum bands in play right now. There's about to be an auction on 2.5 gigahertz, which was traditionally held for schools and libraries and had some commercial aspects to it. We had an auction earlier in the year for C-band, which is 3700 to 4200, which contains satellite systems. We had CBRS, which is 3550 to 3700, which contains both licensed and unlicensed applications, or licensed and licensed by rule applications. In band 48 in CBRS, that's about as close to localized applications of allocations of frequencies as you're going to be able to get in the United States for right now. You can get a grant from a SAS under a PAL or even under GAA and use it for a specific type of use. The great thing about CBRS in the 3500 band is that it is technology agnostic, which means that an agricultural use or an industrial use, or for that matter a venue, or even something simple as moisture sensing in a agricultural environment can be used. And so that's a way to do partitioning. I call it partitioning because it's what private networks really are. It's taking a segment of the spectrum, using it for a specific purpose, generally in a specific geographic region and with specific command and control. So for us and for me, I think right now the ability to use CBRS in that fashion sort of steps in the shoes of virtual assigned segments as are being done in other countries. But I sure would like to see both of them here.
Thanks, Marcus.
Yeah, I think that the dedicated spectrum, the localized spectrum, is important for enterprise use, and it has to be affordable and it has to be easy to access. I mean, if we look at the public CSPs type of fight to spectrum, there are auctions, there's a lot of money involved, and of course they have a different purpose. For industry, it should be easy. You should apply and just get it and use it in your factory. And then you should be able to set up a private network quickly, efficiently, and start making money. I mean, this is the idea. Making money means saving money. Additionally, if you are a localized, if you have your localized spectrum, you don't need to worry about kind of frequency planning or how do you disturb others and so on. So the dedicated spectrum is key here. And since we're talking about mostly controlled environments in factories or enterprises, it's much better to achieve the goals. So I would go for that. Yeah.
Christian?
Before
Yes.
Christian goes, can I just ask
Yes,
add
sure.
one thing to what Maki said?
Uh-huh.
I want to underscore the word affordable, so that smaller entities can do things. It's not just MNOs that does things in the private network area. There needs to be affordable spectrum. And in the United States, and I believe in other countries as well, there is a process for secondary market. It's not mature. It is something that the US probably should place a lot of concentration on. But if you could have people who are not using their spectrum do sub-licenses or leases such that those can be used for private networks. It would facilitate and advance that affordability. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt Christian, but I wanted to underscore what Maki said.
Go ahead, Christian.
No problem. No problem. Yes, for me it's the same. The boss, the dedicated spectrum. I have an example. It's Air France. Sorry, I know really well Air France. But for example, the main airport where Air France has a lot of flights, it's important to have a dedicated spectrum because it's the heart of the business for Air France. If they have some trouble with 70 flight on the ground at the same time, it's impossible to manage. It's really impossible. And if you need to share something, it could happen, and I think really it's important. But in the same way, if you have for Air France or another airline in New York, they have 2 flights per day. It's not possible to have a dedicated spectrum for 2 flights, and it's a service with the airport. I think it could be interesting to share the spectrum in this case of airport. I think it's the same for some ports, for a lot of use cases I think could have dedicated some time or not dedicated some other time. It depends on the location, on the use case. It's really what I see today. And to be honest, again, if you have some trouble with the sharp, it was really mandatory to have the dedicated spectrum like the Tetra, the PMR on the ground for the in the Roissy airport. It's the same for KLM in Schiphol. Because again, a lot of flight at the same time, and it's not possible impossible to have some trouble with this kind of connectivity. In the end, it's finished. The airline is stopped. It's stuck. It's not possible. It's really what I think today, and it's the same for a lot of other industries, I think.
Thanks, Sam. You comment on that?
Yeah. Again, I don't want to repeat what the panelists have said, but it depends again on the application. So lower frequency, if they're licensed, you can get better coverage. Higher frequencies if throughput is critical. But the other point that I'd like to make is in all of these bands, you're never certain of what's actually in that spectrum, because people have amplifiers, inverters nowadays, lots of different electronics everywhere across the whole globe, and we don't know where they resonate. So, a recent example is we were doing a site survey, and there were spikes in the frequencies that just weren't expected to be there. And it was just local electronics, amplifiers, things like that. And they need to be, you need to make sure that that spectrum is clear, make sure that it's safe, make sure that there's no interferers that are going to cause a problem. But yeah, it's going to be application specific.
Thank you. Let's start with Max this time. So, and there are quite a few questions from the audience on this as well. So if there is so much of variation in spectrum, I think harmonization of the spectrum across the globe, be it shared or dedicated, makes sense, right? But it's very hard to achieve. Any thoughts there on whether it's important so that there's no fragmented ecosystem in terms of devices, in terms of so on? How important is harmonization and how to achieve it? Marcus?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, absolutely. Harmonization is very important, and it will facilitate the healthy growth of the ecosystem. I think we are looking at the moment, we started like with Europe, we have the 3.7 gigahertz, and then we also look at the 2.5. We have seen also in Japan and in other Asian countries that they are looking at some spectrum options. And it is not a vast kind of list there, but it started being converging. So we need to keep, of course, our options open, but getting everybody to agree on the same spectrum for industry would be very helpful. What we have seen in MFA is this ecosystem growth, and apart from the difficulties for creating the right features, also spectrum is one of the things that is necessary. So if you look at 3GPP, they have a lot of options for combining different spectrums together. They're all there. I think it now needs some courage and effort to try to identify this, and maybe regulators can play a role here if they can harmonize between different countries. So, for example, in Europe, you could have the same type of industrial spectrum as other regions as well. But it's not easy. It's easy to say, but difficult to do. But certainly, we need to start looking more to alert the regulators about the need for that. And it will be step by step, I think. When the industry starts showing that they're profiting for this kind of approach, they would be more spectrum open, I think.
Christian?
Yes, I agree for sure, and it's really the goal of ARENA today of the association, and it's to obtain harmonization at minimum in Europe. It's sure because today we see the nightmare between the different countries, and the process are not the same. Sure, it will be the best for the European area to obtain an harmonization, as Maki said, regarding the bonds, 3.8, for example, and 4.2, and ARENA wants to be there if there is some. Sometime the regulator asks the industry, do you need spectrum for 5G? And again, I explained that they don't know if they need or not today, because they don't know spectrum, they don't know what is it. It's not possible for them to answer. And ARENA is there to answer. If there is a demand from a regulator, Portuguese, in different countries, and they said, okay, we did not receive any answer from the industrial. It seems that nobody wants a private spectrum for the industry 4.0. ARENA is there to make lobbying and to group the different industrials, the European industrials, to show the demand, to show the needs for all of the countries. For example, some European countries, I know mainly the French, for example, Total, but also Airbus, on BP, if they want to create a new, if they have some factory in one country and they create the Industry 4.0 with private network in France, in UK, in Germany, and they are not able to deploy something in this country, like Poland, I don't know, and some others, it's a nightmare in the end, and it's really what we work today. It's and also for the ecosystem. It's the boss, harmonization of the spectrum, sure, but also for the ecosystem to decrease in the end the price for the enterprises. It's really what I see today, and we work on it, sure. I think that it's really mandatory.
Thanks. Sam, any quick comments?
Yeah, and harmonization would be ideal, because if you look at even just the technologies that are introduced with 5G, they're so different to anything that's come before. Even the beamforming antennas using time division duplex, all these things add challenges to these deployments, and we're seeing that in the commercial cellular world. So there's harmonization within countries, but yeah, trying to build it across the region would definitely make the rollout a lot simpler.
Sure.
Yeah, well, I think harmonization is the ideal, but I think if we can at least share some of the premises of a harmonization, we would be moving a big step forward. As Sam just said, there's a lot of new technologies like beamforming and MIMO and ways to reuse spectrum effectively. There's better technology now on interference mitigation and management. There's better propagation planning that can be done. And much more ability to coordinate and coexist within bands. And so if we could at least take things and go, low, middle, and high, go with the low bands and the mid bands and the millimeter waves and so forth, and then figure out how we can use these tools that we're beginning to develop, then harmonization between countries, harmonization between different types of uses will allow a lot more options and a lot more robust systems, I believe.
All right. So a quick question. I mean, there are a lot of questions on from the audience on this as well. Is basically should governments designate some spectrums? For example, if current spectrums that are being used in Europe and US, like the CBRS spectrum in the US and the 3.5 gigahertz in Europe, should other countries follow that, or how is the? It's easy to say the harmonization is important, but any ideas on how somebody should achieve it? Who should drive it? Right? Let's start with Richard quickly.
Well, I've had the pleasure of working with the regulatory entities and the industry associations and multi-stakeholder groups from a number of nations while developing the standards for CBRS. And even now, 5 years later, we frequently get country regulatory entities coming to us to look at the model we're using for that, not necessarily for 3550 to 3700, but to model that sort of approach for other bands. So I think that's really the key, is to sort of start looking at the models and the mechanisms and allow those things to replicate into other countries, so that there are commonalities that benefits the equipment market, that benefits standards and the ability to create uniform standards. I dare say it might even improve some relationships between countries. But generally speaking, I'm not sure that we have to say this frequency must match up to that frequency with exactly the same rules in every country. We just use the tools that work in those frequencies and allow each other to share those, and I think that will make it go a long way.
Thanks. There's a lot of audience questions coming, so I'm trying to combine them so that we answer as much as we can. So let's start with Sam now. So if we are using shared spectrum and so on without dedicated spectrum, how do you ensure you get quality of service?
So I think that comes down to, I think that's where the standards give that difference between, perhaps I'd suggest, between 3GPP and current Wi-Fi. There's SLAs built into the cellular technologies, and a certain robustness as well. And I think the way, for instance, the technology works now, the TDD technology, that allows you to use the full bandwidth more effectively. And I think that's where perhaps we need to work together with other countries to ensure that we don't see cross-border interference or what looks like interference, and it just comes down to the way the technology's been implemented. So I think the regulators could potentially help with that, because everyone has their own approach. Some suggest using these synchronization methods or numbers, and others say, okay, you work it out between yourselves. So I think it makes sense if everyone followed kind of the same rules, really.
Perfect. Marcus, especially with
Yeah,
Modifier, been a proponent of dedicated spectrum for a long time.
yeah, absolutely. I agree with Sam here. I think that the basis for making a better sharing in the spectrum is technology. And when we designed Multifier, and now also the 3GPP NRU is based on the same principles, that it's very oriented for with scheduling, and it takes care of all the nice technology developments in TDD and so on. So it makes a huge difference when you compare the system like NRU, for example, or Multifier versus Wi-Fi, when it aggressively grabs the spectrum and creates, especially when you have load of when you load the system, then you see the difference. Then that's why Wi-Fi fails in this respect. So I think that the technology is important, but also what we need to understand is again the regulation of the countries, and the difference, the different kind of power limits and spectrum requirements that are very also important to take into account.
Okay, so we are coming to close of this session. Let me ask this last question to all of you. We'll start with Richard this time. So if we were to meet, say, in next 5 years, where the private network spectrum situation discussion would be? 30 seconds. Start with Richard and for the others.
Yeah, it's hard to predict. Predictions are always hard to make, but I do see a pathway for private networks moving forward in a very orderly fashion, probably a little slow over the next couple of years, but ramping up over the following 3 years, such that it will have a very significant place, especially in industry,
All right,
where I believe
thanks.
it'll be very important.
Thanks. Christian, quickly, 30 seconds.
Oh, quickly, difficult. In 5 years, all of the private networks will be deployed, and we will have to discuss on work on the interconnection between the different private networks, for example, the airport, something like that, and also discuss about what about 5G, 6G in 5 years.
Yeah. Thanks, Marcus. 20 seconds.
More locally licensed spectrum harmonized and better ecosystem, especially on devices.
Thank you. Sam, you get the last word.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think it comes down to cost, right? Depending on the spectrum, that will be the enabler on who takes it up and who doesn't take it up.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, that was a great discussion. I'm afraid that's all time we had. Let me thank you all, you panelists, for an engaging and informative session. And of course, thanks to all the audience with very interesting questions. Sorry we could not answer all of them. And indeed, it was a great pleasure moderating this panel for the group. Thank you very much again. Hope to catch you on the next one. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.